Sit down." The billionaire's voice cracked across the ballroom like a whip, and 300 of the richest people in New York froze mid-breath. She pointed one manicured finger at the black waiter standing in the wreckage of a dropped champagne tray and said it again, louder, uglier. "I said sit down before you embarrass yourself in front of every camera in this room." But Daniel Brooks didn't sit down. He rolled up his sleeve, looked past her at the $50 million model glowing on the screen, and said 6 words that would blow her empire apart. "Your equation just killed everyone's money. Here's what nobody in that room knew. Not the billionaire, not the cameras, not even the man himself 5 years ago on the worst night of his life. Daniel had already solved this exact problem. Alone in a library with his dead wife's coat still folded in his lap. And in about 90 seconds, the woman trying to humiliate him was going to learn who she'd just challenged. Before we go further, drop the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe real talent doesn't wait for permission, hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because the moment she goes quiet is the moment you'll never forget. The tray hit the floor before Daniel Brooks even decided to drop it. That was the thing he'd remember later, that his hands moved before his mind gave permission. 1 second, he was carrying 11 crystal flutes of champagne across the ballroom of the Meridian, the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. The next second, the tray was on the marble glass, shattering in a bright silver spray, and every single person in that room was staring at a waiter who had just made a scene. He didn't look down at the mess. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the giant screen at the front of the room, where a number glowed in cold white light. A number that was wrong. A number that 300 of the wealthiest investors in America were about to bet a fortune on. "Sir?" A hand gripped his elbow. It was Marcus, the floor manager, hissing under his breath. Daniel, pick that up, right now. What is wrong with you?" But Daniel didn't move, because up on that stage in a $2,000 suit stood Victoria Sterling, 31 years old, worth $11 billion, the woman half of Wall Street feared, and the other half wanted to be. And she had just paused her presentation to squint into the sudden silence, trying to figure out what had interrupted her. "Is there," Victoria said slowly into the microphone, "a problem?" Nobody answered. 300 people turned in their chairs to see who had dared. And Daniel Brooks, a 34-year-old widower who made $11 an hour plus tips, who had a 9-year-old daughter asleep in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, who hadn't spoken more than still or sparkling to a customer in 5 years, heard himself say the words out loud. "Ma'am," he said, "your entire model is wrong. Let me take you back 6 hours. Because to understand why a man would throw away the only job standing between his daughter and the street, you have to understand what that morning looked like. 6 o'clock. Still dark. Daniel was already awake. The way he was always already awake, lying on his back on the fold-out couch. He called a bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked a little like the state of Ohio. He heard the small feet before he saw them. Dad. Ava padded into the room in her socks holding a piece of paper. 9 years old, hair in the 2 puffs he'd learned to do himself over 5 years of YouTube tutorials and a whole lot of apologizing. "Dad, I need you to check something." "It's 6 in the morning, baby." "I know, but I've been thinking about it all night." He sat up, rubbed his face, and reached for the light. "Thinking about what?" She climbed up next to him and laid the paper on his knee. It was a math worksheet. 4th grade multiplication mostly, but at the bottom she'd written her own problem, something she'd made up. "So my teacher said you can't divide by 0, Ava said. "But she wouldn't tell me why. She just said you can't. And I hate when people say you can't without saying why." Daniel felt something warm and painful move through his chest, because that was her mother's voice coming right out of a 9-year-old's mouth. "I hate when people say you can't without saying why." Sarah used to say exactly that. "Okay," he said quietly. "Come here. I'll tell you why. For real, watch." He took the pencil. Division is really just asking a question. When you say 12 divided by 3, you're asking how many 3s fit inside 12. Write 4 3s. So the answer's 4. Okay. So when you say 12 divided by 0, you're asking how many zeros fit inside 12. Ava's face scrunched up. But 0 doesn't fit into anything. It's nothing. Exactly. You could put in 1,000 zeros, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000, and you'd still have 12 because zeros don't add up to anything. So there's no answer. Not because we're not smart enough to find it. Because the question itself is broken. Ava sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes were doing the thing Sarah's used to do. "Dad," she said, "how do you know all this stuff?" And there it was. The question he never knew how to answer. "I read a lot of books," he said. "You always say that." "Because it's true. Go get dressed. Grandma Ruth's coming at 7:30, and I've got the early shift." She slid off the couch, then stopped in the doorway. "Dad." "Yeah." "You're smarter than my teacher." He laughed, but it caught in his throat. "Don't tell her that." "I already did." And she was gone, and Daniel sat there on the fold-out couch in the dark, holding a fourth-grade worksheet, and for one terrible second, he let himself remember the man he used to be. The one who stood in front of a lecture hall. The one whose name was on a paper cited 200 times. The one who was supposed to be somebody. Then he folded the memory up small the way he did every morning and put it away. Because that man died the same night Sarah did. The Meridian didn't hire men like Daniel to be seen. It hired them to move through the room like water present when you needed something invisible when you didn't. That was the whole art of the job, and Daniel was the best at it. 5 years, and he'd learned to read a table the way he used to read an equation, who wanted attention, who wanted to be left alone, who was going to stiff him on the tip, and who was going to overtip to prove something. He'd learned to be invisible so well that sometimes he wondered if he still existed. Brooks. Marcus caught him in the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon before service. "You're on the floor tonight. Private event. Big one." "How big?" "Sterling Capital." Marcus said it like the name should mean something, and to him it did. "Victoria Sterling. You know who that is." "Should I?" Marcus stared at him. "She's Daniel. She's the biggest thing on Wall Street right now. 11 billion. She built some kind of AI that predicts the markets. There's going to be press. Cameras. Half the Forbes list is walking through that door tonight, so I need you on. You hear me? No mistakes. These are the kind of people who'll get a man fired because his cufflink was crooked." "I don't wear cufflinks. You know what I mean." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder, and his voice softened, because underneath all the panic, he wasn't a bad guy. "Look, I know you. You're my best server. That's why you're on this. Just keep your head down, do the thing you do, and we all get a fat cut of the tip pool. Okay." "Okay, Marcus." "You good? You look tired." "I'm always tired." "Yeah." Marcus almost smiled. "Aren't we all?" By 7, the room was full, and Daniel understood for the first time what old money meets new money actually looked like standing in the same space. Hedge fund men in suits that cost more than his rent. Tech founders in $100 t-shirts trying to look like they didn't care. Waiters gliding between them with trays of things Daniel couldn't afford to taste. And then the room changed. He felt it before he saw it, that shift in the air when the most important person walks in. The volume dropped. Heads turned. And Victoria Sterling walked through the doors of the Meridian like she'd bought the building on the way in which, for all Daniel knew, she had. She was younger than he'd expected. Sharper. She moved fast and talked faster, and everywhere she went, a little cluster of assistants and analysts scrambled to keep up, all of them holding tablets, all of them terrified. "Champagne." Daniel offered, tray extended as she passed. She didn't even look at him. Took a glass without breaking stride, without slowing her conversation, the way you'd grab a napkin from a dispenser. That was fine. He was used to that. He didn't need her to see him. He had no idea that in 2 hours, he'd give her no choice. The presentation started at 8:30. Victoria took the stage, really a raised platform at the front of the room, and behind her, a screen the size of a garage door lit up. Daniel was working the back tables, refilling water-clearing plates, doing the invisible dance. He wasn't listening. He'd trained himself not to listen to the things rich people said because it only ever made him angry. But then a number went up on the screen. And Daniel's eyes out of 5 years of habit, 5 years of hunger, 5 years of a starving part of his brain that never got to eat. Daniel's eyes went to it. The way a recovering man's eyes go to a bottle. It was a financial model, a prediction engine. Victoria was walking the room through how her AI forecast market movements, and the whole thing rested on a core equation glowing up there in white. Daniel read it once. He kept walking. Then he stopped walking. He read it again, and a cold feeling started in his stomach and climbed. No, he thought. No, you're tired. You're seeing things. You've been standing for 6 hours. Keep moving. He moved. He cleared a plate. He refilled a glass. But his eyes kept going back to that screen, and every time they did the wrong thing, got louder. There was a variable in the denominator. And under a specific market condition, one Victoria was at that very moment describing to the room as the model's greatest strength, that variable could approach 0. How many zeros fit inside 12? The same thing he'd explained to his daughter that morning. The exact same broken question. Except Victoria's model didn't know the question was broken. It would keep computing right up until the denominator collapsed, and then the whole prediction would spike into nonsense. A number so large it would look like the discovery of the century, instead of the failure it actually was. And every investor in this room chasing that fake number would pour money into a market position that would evaporate the second reality caught up. Not thousands. Not millions. Hundreds of millions. Daniel stood very still in the back of the room with a dirty plate in his hand and felt his whole body go to war with itself. Not your job, not your problem. Keep your head down. Ava needs you to keep this job. This is the kind of place that fires a man for a crooked cufflink. What do you think they do to a waiter who tells a billionaire she's wrong in front of 300 people? He thought about Ava's face that morning. You're smarter than my teacher. He thought about Sarah. What Sarah would say. He knew exactly what Sarah would say, because Sarah never in her life let him be small. I hate when people say you can't without saying why. But it wasn't about being smart in that moment. It wasn't about pride. Daniel looked around the room and did the thing. His brain had never stopped doing. The thing that made him useless for a normal life and dangerous in a room like this. He ran the numbers on the people. Somewhere in this room was a man who'd put his retirement into sterling capital. Somewhere was a woman managing a pension fund, teachers maybe, or firefighters, who trusted this model because a magazine told her to. Those people weren't billionaires. They were just names on an account, and they were about to lose everything, and the only person in the entire building who could see it coming was the guy holding the dirty plate. Not your problem, said the voice that had kept him alive for 5 years. Then whose is it? Said the other one. Daniel set the plate down on the nearest table, and he started walking toward the front of the room. I didn't have a plan. That was the thing. A smarter man, a man with something to lose that he was willing to protect, would have found Marcus. Would have whispered it quietly. Would have let someone with a title carry the message so it wouldn't cost him anything. But Daniel had learned something in 5 years of being invisible. When you send a message through the proper channels, the proper channels are the ones who decide whether it ever arrives. And this message couldn't wait. I got maybe halfway to the stage before a waiter carrying 11 flutes of champagne is a hard thing to ignore, and he realized he was still holding the tray from the last table, and his hands. His hands moved before his mind gave permission. The tray hit the marble. Bang. Glass everywhere. And now you know how we got here. Ma'am, Daniel said into a silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Your entire model is wrong. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room did what rooms full of powerful people always do when something breaks the script. It laughed, not all at once. It started somewhere in the back, a single sharp bark of a laugh from a man who thought this was the most entertaining thing he'd seen all year, and then it spread table to table until half the room was chuckling and the other half was leaning to their neighbors to whisper, "Who is that? Is that a waiter?" Did the waiter just... Marcus appeared at Daniel's side, so fast, it was like he'd teleported face-gray hands, already up in the universal gesture of "This is a terrible mistake, and I am so sorry." Ms. Sterling, I am so sorry, he's Daniel. What are you doing? Marcus. Daniel didn't take his eyes off the screen. It's the third term, the denominator. Daniel. Look at it. Up on the platform, Victoria Sterling had gone very quiet. She was not laughing. That was the thing that changed everything, though. Nobody caught it in the moment, the way the smartest person in any room can always spot the second smartest, even when the second smartest is wearing a waiter's uniform. The rest of the room saw a joke. Victoria saw a man who was not smiling. A man who wasn't drunk, wasn't confused, wasn't looking for attention. A man who was looking at her screen the way she looked at a screen. And it unsettled her in a way she couldn't have explained. She lifted the microphone. Everyone. Her voice cut the laughter dead. Please. The room went quiet again. Victoria looked down from the platform at the black man standing in a puddle of champagne and broken crystal, and she asked the question that would, though neither of them knew it yet, change both their lives. What did you say your name was? I didn't. He met her eyes. Daniel. Daniel. She let it sit. Do you know what this is, Daniel? Daniel, what you're looking at? Yes, ma'am. Do you? A thin, cold smile. Because a team built this. 12 people. 4 of them have PhDs from MIT. 2 are former quants from Goldman. It took them 19 months and $40 million, and it is currently, as we speak, managing more money than most countries have. So I'm going to give you one chance because I'm curious, and because I've had a long day to tell me what a man carrying my champagne thinks he sees that MIT missed. Somebody in the room laughed again. Somebody else said, "Oh my God," under their breath, delighted phone already out and recording. Marcus grabbed Daniel's arm. Daniel, walk away, right now. I'll fix this. Just walk. The third term, Daniel said, ignoring him completely, addressing Victoria, and only Victoria, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. You've got a volatility variable in the denominator, sigma sub t. You're treating it like it can never hit zero, because historically, it never has in your training data. But your training data only goes back to 2009. It doesn't include a real liquidity freeze. It doesn't include the kind of event where the market just stops. And in that kind of event, sigma sub t doesn't approach zero gradually. It collapses, all at once. And when it does what? Victoria's smile was gone now. When it does, your model divides by something that's basically zero. And the output doesn't fail. That's the problem. It doesn't error out. It returns an enormous positive signal, a buy signal. So strong, it'll look like the greatest opportunity in the history of your fund. And every person in this room who's chasing that signal will pour money into the exact position that's about to wipe them out. Your model won't just miss the crash. Daniel's jaw tightened. It'll cause people to run straight into it. The silence in the room was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of 300 wealthy people slowly realizing that the joke might not be a joke. Victoria Sterling stood very still on her platform. Then she turned slowly and looked at the screen behind her. At the equation she had presented to investors on 4 continents. At the third term. At sigma sub t, sitting in the denominator exactly where the waiter said it was. And for 1/2 of 1 second so fast that only the cameras caught it, and only later in slow motion would anyone see it. Something crossed Victoria Sterling's face that had never crossed it in public before. Doubt. Then she buried it the way she buried everything, and turned back to the room with a smile bright enough to sell. Well, she said, that's quite a theory, from quite a source. She looked at Daniel. You have a background in mathematics, Daniel finance. What are you, a grad student picking up shifts, an analyst who lost his nerve? I'm a waiter. You're a waiter. Yes, ma'am. And where did a waiter learn to read a stochastic volatility model? Daniel didn't answer that. He couldn't. Not without opening a door he'd kept locked for 5 years in front of 300 strangers and a dozen cameras. His silence hung in the air. And Victoria Sterling, who had built an empire on the belief that intelligence came from the right schools, the right families, the right doors opening at the right times, who had clawed her way up from more than most of these people knew, and had decided somewhere along the way that the ladder she climbed was the only ladder. Victoria mistook that silence for a bluff. "That's what I thought," she said softly, and she made her mistake. "Here's what we're going to do," Victoria announced, turning to the room back in control, the showman's rhythm returning to her voice. "Because I think this is a wonderful teaching moment, and because I never let a good story go to waste." She descended 2 steps off the platform until she was on the floor on Daniel's level, which some people in the room registered as generous, and Daniel registered as the opposite, the powerful step down, only when they're certain they'll be looking up at you again in a minute. "This man," she said, gesturing to him, "believes he's found a flaw in a model that cost me $40 million, in front of all of you, in front of the press." She let the cameras drink it in. "So let's find out, right here, right now. I'll put the full model on the screen, every equation, every assumption. And Daniel," she said his name like she was tasting it, "Daniel is going to walk us through every single error he thinks he's found. And if he's right—" She paused. The whole room leaned in. "If he's right about even one material error that my team missed one, I will write him a check tonight in front of every camera in this room for $5 million. The room detonated. Gasps. A whoop from somewhere. A dozen phones lifting at once. Marcus made a sound like a dying animal. "But," Victoria continued, and the but dropped the temperature 10 degrees. "If he's wrong. If this is what I think it is, a man who read a couple of finance blogs and wanted his 15 minutes. Then he walks out that door tonight, and he never carries a tray in this city again. Because I'll make sure of it personally." She smiled. "That's the deal. That's fair. High risk, high reward. Isn't that what all of you are here for?" She turned back to Daniel and lowered her voice just for him, though the microphone caught it anyway. "So, what's it going to be, Daniel? You want to take back what you said? Apologize. Help clean up the glass. Keep your little job. Nobody would blame you." Her eyes glittered. "Or do you want to bet everything you have on the idea that you, a waiter, are smarter than 12 of the best trained minds in the world?" Everyone expected him to fold. Of course they did. Look at the math of it. On one side, a steady job, a paycheck, a daughter who needed rent paid, and a fridge full of food. On the other, the word of a billionaire, 300 witnesses, and the total ruin of the only stability a man had built in 5 years of grief. A sane man folds. A man with a child folds first. Marcus was practically pulling on his sleeve now. Daniel, please. Take the out. She's giving you the out. We laugh it off. I keep you on. We never talk about this again, please man, please." And Daniel Brooks thought about Ava. He thought about her that morning holding a worksheet asking, "How do you know all this stuff?" Dad and him saying, "I read a lot of books," the way he always said it. The small answer, the safe answer, the answer that let him stay invisible. I thought about the day he was going to have to tell her the whole truth. Who her father used to be. What he gave up and why, and whether it was for her, or whether if he was honest in the dark on the fold-out couch staring at Ohio on the ceiling, whether some of it was just fear. Whether he'd told himself it was all for her, when part of it was that he was terrified to walk back into a world that had never once made room for a man like him. I thought about what kind of story he wanted his daughter to be able to tell about her father. And he thought, she's watching this. Not literally. Ava was asleep in Queens with Grandma Ruth on the couch. But there were a dozen cameras in this room, and this was going online tonight, whether he liked it or not. And someday, 5 years, 10 years, his daughter was going to see this video. She was going to watch her father stand in a puddle of champagne, being offered a way out, and she was going to see what he did. Daniel looked at Victoria Sterling. He looked at the screen. He looked for 1 second at Marcus's terrified face, and something in him softened. "It's okay, Marcus," he said quietly. "It's not on you. Whatever happens, it's on me." Then he turned back to the billionaire, and he did the thing that no one in that room, including himself, thought a waiter would do. He took off his apron. He folded it slowly, deliberately, the way you fold something you're not sure you'll ever put back on. And he set it on the edge of the nearest table on top of the mess he'd made. And he said, "Keep the cameras running." The room went dead silent. Victoria's smile flickered. "Put the whole model up," Daniel said, and his voice had changed. Dropped something, picked up something else. An authority that hadn't been there when he was offering champagne, an authority that came from somewhere none of them could see. Not the highlight reel, the whole thing. Every equation, every assumption, every piece of your training data. He rolled up one sleeve, then the other. "You said one error. I'm not going to find you one error, ma'am." He looked up at the screen, and for the first time in 5 years, Daniel Brooks let the whole world see the man who'd been hiding behind the uniform. "I'm going to find you all of them." Nobody moved. 300 of the most powerful people in America sat frozen, phones raised, watching a waiter with rolled-up sleeves stare down a billionaire, and every one of them understood in the pit of their stomach that they had just watched a story stop being funny. Victoria Sterling held his gaze for a long, long moment, and then, because she was proud, because she was certain, because she had spent her entire life believing that the world was sorted correctly, and that the people at the top were there because they belonged there, she made the second worst decision of her career. She gestured to her lead analyst. A young man, MIT terrified, clutching a laptop. "Put it up," she said. "All of it." "Ms. Sterling, that's proprietary, the whole room will see. Put it up." She never took her eyes off Daniel. "He wants the whole model. Give the man the whole model." A cold smile. "Let's find out who he really is." The analyst's fingers moved across the keyboard, and the screen behind Victoria Sterling went dark for 1 second. The whole room holding its breath in that second. 300 people, a dozen cameras, and somewhere in Queens, a little girl asleep who had no idea that her father was about to stop being invisible forever. And then it filled top to bottom with the entire architecture of an $11 billion machine. Every equation, every variable, every hidden assumption that 12 of the best paid minds in the world had spent 19 months building. Daniel Brooks looked up at it. His eyes moved across the first line, and a small, quiet sound came out of him that no one but Marcus was close enough to hear. It was almost a laugh, because he'd already found the second one. The second one was worse than the first. Daniel stood there in his rolled-up sleeves, staring at the wall of equations, and for a moment he forgot the 300 people, forgot the cameras, forgot the woman who'd just told him to sit down. Because the math had him now. It always did. It grabbed him the way it grabbed him when he was 19 years old, and first understood what a proof really was, that feeling of a door opening in a dark room of the whole world, rearranging itself into something clean and true. "Well," Victoria said. She'd folded her arms. She was performing patience for the cameras, but Daniel could hear the edge under it. "You wanted the whole model. There it is. You said you'd find all my errors." A thin smile. "The clock's running, Daniel. Or should I call you sir, since apparently you're the smartest man in the room now?" Somebody laughed. It wasn't as loud as before. Daniel didn't turn around. "You can call me whatever you want, ma'am. Give me a marker." "Excuse me. A marker, a pen, something." He held out his hand without looking. "I can't point at a screen and expect 300 people to follow me. I need to write." There was a beat where nothing happened. Then a young woman near the front, one of Victoria's own analysts, a girl who couldn't have been more than 25, stood up before she'd decided to walk to the presentation table, grabbed a fat black marker and a pad of the giant sticky notes they'd used for the setup and carried them to him. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. The girl looked at him. "You really think there's something wrong with it? What's your name?" "Priya." "Priya, you worked on this. The data pipeline, not the core equations, but—" "Then you already know," Daniel said, gentle just for her. "You've felt it. Something in the tails that never sat right. Am I wrong?" Priya's face did something complicated, and she went back to her seat without answering, which was its own kind of answer. Victoria watched the whole exchange with her arms still folded. "Are you recruiting my staff now, Daniel, in the middle of your own execution?" "No, ma'am." He uncapped the marker. "I'm just telling the truth. Turns out it's contagious." That got a reaction. A low ooh rolled through the room, the sound a crowd makes when a fight it thought was over turns out to have a second round. Marcus, standing off to the side with his hands pressed to his mouth, made a strangled noise. He'd stopped trying to pull Daniel away. He'd realized somewhere in the last 2 minutes that there was no pulling Daniel away from this, that whatever was about to happen was already happening, and the best he could do was witness it. Daniel wrote something on the giant pad. A single line. Then he tore it off, walked to the screen and held it up next to the third term. "Okay," he said, and now his voice filled the room steady and clear. "Let's start with the one I already told you about. The volatility variable. Sigma sub t in the denominator." He tapped the screen. "Ms. Sterling told you this is the model's strength. The way it stays calm when the market panics. And in normal conditions, she's right. It's elegant. Honestly, it's beautiful work." He let that land because it was true, and because he'd learned a long time ago that you never win an argument by pretending the other side was stupid. But elegant and correct aren't the same thing. Watch. He started writing. He wrote faster than a man. Scribbling should be able to write and still be readable. The marker squeaking across the giant paper symbols flowing out of him in clean rows. And the room, which had come to laugh, got very quiet because there's something about watching a person do a thing they were built to do. It doesn't matter if you understand it. You can feel it. The way you can feel a great singer hit a note, even if you can't sing, the way you can feel an athlete move, even if you've never played the game. 300 people who couldn't have followed the math to save their lives sat and watched Daniel Brooks fill a page with it, and every single one of them understood that they were watching something real. "There," he said and stepped back. "Now, anybody in this room with a quantitative background, and I know there's a few of you, I've been refilling your water all night, you tell me. What happens to that expression as sigma approaches zero?" Nobody spoke. "Come on." Daniel almost smiled. "You paid for the good schools. Somebody tell me." A man in the third row cleared his throat. Older, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd made his money the slow way and didn't scare easy. "It blows up," he said. "The output. It goes to infinity." "It goes to infinity," Daniel agreed. "Thank you, sir. What's your name?" "Harrison. Ed Harrison." "Mr. Harrison runs numbers for a living, I'd bet." Daniel pointed at him with the marker. "And Mr. Harrison just told you the truth for free, which is more than you got from the $40 million model. As sigma goes to zero, the output goes to infinity, which means the model in a real liquidity freeze doesn't say danger. It says jackpot. The single strongest buy signal it's ever produced, generated at the exact moment the market is about to fall out from under you." He turned to Victoria. "Your machine doesn't just miss the cliff, ma'am. It sprints toward it and drags every investor in this room along by the wallet." Victoria's jaw was tight. "That's a hypothetical. Sigma has never gone to zero in 12 years of your data." Daniel said it softly, but it cut through the room. "That's the whole problem. Your data starts in 2009. You know what happened in 2008. Silence. "You don't have it," Daniel said. "The one event that would break your model is the one event you trained it to forget. You built a machine to survive a storm, and then you only ever showed it sunny days." He shook his head, and there was no cruelty in it, just something almost like grief. "That's not a small mistake, ma'am. That's the kind of mistake that ends funds, that ends careers, that takes the retirement money out of the pocket of some school teacher in Ohio who never met you and never will, and just trusted the number in the brochure." The word school teacher did something to the room. Daniel watched it happen. These were rich people, sure, but a lot of them had come from somewhere. Had a mother who taught third grade, a father who drove a bus, a grandparent who'd worked 40 years for a pension that was probably right now invested in something not so different from what glowed on that screen. The abstract just got personal, and personal is where fear lives. "That's one," Daniel said. "You want the second one." And that was the moment you could mark it, if you were watching the tape later. Frame by frame, that was the moment Victoria Sterling stopped performing. Up until then, she'd been running the show. Every response calibrated for the cameras, every smile aimed at the story she wanted told. Brilliant CEO indulges a delusional waiter. Waiter, humiliated, order restored. But somewhere in the last 90 seconds, the story had slipped out of her hands and she felt it go. She unfolded her arms. She took one step closer to the screen, and now she wasn't looking at Daniel or the cameras or the crowd. She was looking at the math. Her math. The thing she'd stood in front of investors on 4 continents and sworn was perfect. "Show me the second one," she said. And her voice was different, quieter. The showman was gone. What was left underneath was the thing that had actually made her a billionaire. Not the confidence, not the ruthlessness, but this, the part of her that when someone put a real problem in front of her, could not look away from it. Daniel heard the change. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, once turned back to the board, and got to work. "The second one's more subtle," he said, writing again. "And it's not just a math error. It's a math error that's covering for something, which is worse." He paused, marker in the air. Because a math error is a mistake. A math error someone tried to hide is a decision. The word hide landed like a stone dropped in still water. "What are you talking about?" Victoria said. "Your correlation matrix." Daniel tapped a dense block of symbols in the lower third of the screen, the part that tells the model how different assets move together. When one thing falls, what else falls with it? This is the heart of any risk model. Get this wrong and nothing else matters because you don't understand your real exposure. He circled a section. Now, in a healthy market, correlations are low. Everything's doing its own thing. Your stocks zig, your bonds zag, your risk is spread out. Everybody sleeps fine at night. Your model assumes that stays roughly true. He drew a hard line under one term. But everyone in this room who lived through a real crash knows the ugly secret of correlations. He turned around. "Mr. Harrison, you know it. Tell them." Ed Harrison had gone pale. "In a crash," he said slowly, "everything correlates. Everything falls together, all at once." "All at once," Daniel repeated. "Correlations go to 1. The diversification that was protecting you evaporates in a single afternoon, right when you need it most." Every professional in this room learned that the hard way at some point in their life because the market teaches it over and over, and we keep forgetting. He turned back to the screen. "So here's my question, Ms. Sterling. Your team knew this. They're not stupid, I keep saying it. They're brilliant. This whole thing is brilliant. So they knew correlations spike in a crisis, which means somewhere in this model there has to be a term that accounts for it. A stress factor. Something that says, when things get bad, assume everything falls together." He scanned the equations up and down, his finger tracing. "So where is it?" Silence. "Where is it, ma'am?" Victoria didn't answer. "It's not here," Daniel said. "I've looked at every line. The term that should model correlation spike in a crisis, it's not in the model." He let that hang. "But here's the strange part. And this is the part that kept me from just walking away tonight. Because a missing term, that's an oversight. That's a bad night, a rushed deadline somebody forgot. It happens." He tapped a specific coefficient buried deep in the matrix. "But this little constant sitting right here where the stress term should be. Somebody set it. By hand. To a value that makes the whole crisis scenario disappear. Not model it. Not soften it. Disappear. It tells your machine that even in a total meltdown, your assets stay independent, which is a thing that has never once been true in the entire history of markets." He turned around slow and looked at Victoria Sterling. "Somebody looked at the ugly answer, ma'am, and then they reached in and typed a prettier one." The room had gone so quiet, Daniel could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Victoria stared at this coefficient he was pointing at. And Daniel watched her face, and he saw clear as day, clear as anything he'd ever read off a page that she hadn't known. Whatever this was, whoever had done it, she was learning about it right now in front of 300 people and a dozen cameras from a waiter. "That's not," she started. Stopped. Started again, and her voice wasn't steady. "That number is a modeling choice. A simplification. You simplify to make the model tractable, everyone does. You can't compute the full, ma'am." Daniel said it kindly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it cruelly. "You and I both know that's not a simplification. A simplification makes the model easier to run. This makes the model lie. And it lies in exactly one direction. It makes your fund look safer than it is. It makes the risk numbers you show investors smaller than they really are. He lowered the marker. I don't think you did this. I want to say that out loud for the cameras. I've watched your face for the last 4 minutes, and I don't think you knew this was in here. But somebody on your team did. Somebody reached into the safest, most important part of your entire company and quietly turned off the smoke detector. And the question you need to be asking the question, all these good people who trusted you with their money need you to ask, is why? For a long moment, Victoria Sterling didn't move. And then a voice spoke up from the side of the room. A man's voice, sharp, defensive, too fast. This is absurd. Everyone turned. It was a heavy-set man in his 50s, one of Victoria's people standing near the analyst's table, his face flushed. Victoria, you're not seriously going to let some server stand here and accuse the firm of fraud on camera. This is defamation. We should be calling security. We should be calling our lawyers. And you are, Daniel asked him calm. I'm the chief risk officer of Sterling Capital, and I don't answer to the help. The chief risk officer. Daniel nodded slowly. So, the correlation matrix. That would be your department, wouldn't it, Risk? The man's mouth opened, closed. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. What's your name? Daniel asked, but he was almost gentle about it now, because he could see the man understood what had just happened, could see the sweat starting at his hairline. For the cameras. You don't get to... Gerald, Victoria said quietly. Everyone turned to her. She was still looking at the screen, at the coefficient, at the number somebody had typed by hand. His name is Gerald Voss. He's been my chief risk officer for 4 years. He built the correlation matrix. She turned finally and looked at Gerald, and something passed between them that the cameras caught and nobody in the room could fully read but everybody could feel. Gerald. He's saying somebody set that constant by hand, to hide the crisis exposure. Her voice was very, very controlled. Is that true? Victoria. Is it true, Gerald? You don't understand the context. I understand the math. She said it flat and cold, and it was the first time all night Daniel had heard her sound like the woman worth $11 billion. I understand the math better than anyone in this building, which apparently includes not understanding what's actually in my own model. So I'm going to ask you one more time in front of these people, and you're going to answer me. Did you set that coefficient by hand? Gerald Voss looked around the room. At the cameras. At the investors, his investors' people. He'd sat across tables from people. He'd shaken hands with people whose money he was responsible for. At Daniel standing there in his rolled sleeves with a marker in his hand. And whatever he saw in all those faces, it broke something in him. The model wouldn't clear compliance with the real number, he said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. The risk numbers were too high. We'd have had to hold 3 times the capital. Nobody would have invested. The whole fund would have... He stopped, swallowed. It was supposed to be temporary, until we raised enough to... Oh my God, someone whispered. It was going to be fixed, Gerald said louder, desperate now, talking to the room, to the cameras, to anyone. You don't launch a fund on numbers that scare people off. That's not how any of this works. Every firm smooths their... Stop talking, Victoria said. Victoria, I did it for the company. I did it for you. Stop talking. He stopped. And Victoria Sterling stood in the middle of the most important night of her career in front of the press. She'd invited the investors, she'd courted the cameras, she'd wanted rolling, and watched her entire empire crack straight down the middle because a waiter had refused to sit down. Daniel, for his part, said nothing. He'd delivered the truth, and now he just let it sit there doing its work the way truth does. There was no triumph on his face. If anything, he looked tired and a little sad, because he knew what this meant for the people in the room whose money was on the line. And he knew that being right about a disaster doesn't stop the disaster. It just means you saw it coming. It was Ed Harrison, the silver-haired man, who finally broke the silence. He stood up, slowly, like his knees hurt, and he pointed at Daniel. I want him to check the rest of it, Harrison said. Ed, Victoria started. No, Victoria. I've got $60 million in your fund. $60 million. My grandkids' money is in your fund. His voice shook, but he kept it steady enough. And a waiter just found 2 holes in it in under 10 minutes that your $40 million team missed. So I don't much care about the show anymore, or the cameras, or who's embarrassed. I want to know how deep this goes." He looked at Daniel. "Son, you said you'd find all of them. Did you mean it?" Daniel met his eyes. "Yes, sir," he said. "I meant it." "Then I want a real expert in this room to check his work as he goes. Independent, not on Sterling's payroll." Harrison looked around. "Somebody in here has to be qualified. This is New York. We've got half of Wall Street in this room." There was a shuffling. Murmurs. And then from near the back, a woman stood up. Older, elegant, with the kind of quiet authority that made people quiet down without her asking. Daniel didn't recognize her, but half the room clearly did, judging by how they turned. "I'll do it," she said. "And you are?" Daniel asked. "Dr. Eleanor Chen." She was already moving toward the front, shrugging off a shawl all business. "I chaired the mathematics department at Columbia for 11 years before I retired. I've refereed papers on exactly this class of model. I have no money in sterling capital and no reason to protect anyone in this room." She reached the front, stood beside Daniel, and looked up at the screen, then at him. "I'll check every line you write, young man. And if you make a single mistake, I'll say so loudly." Fair. Something moved across Daniel's face. Something that wasn't fear and wasn't pride, but was close to both. Because Dr. Eleanor Chen was exactly the kind of person he'd once dreamed of being. The kind of person who in another life might have been his colleague, his mentor. And here she was standing next to a waiter ready to referee. "Fair," he said. "More than fair. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Don't thank me yet." A ghost of a smile. "Thank me if you're right." She turned to the room and raised her voice. "For the record, and for the cameras, I am watching this man's work in real time, and I will confirm or dispute every claim he makes. Nobody leaves here able to say this was staged." She looked at Victoria. "Ms. Sterling, do you object?" Victoria Sterling looked like a woman standing in the wreckage of her own house. But she was still standing. That was the thing about her that Daniel would come to understand later. She did not run from a burning building. She walked toward the fire to see how it started. "No," she said. "I don't object. Check everything." She turned to Daniel, and her voice was low and stripped of all the performance, all the cruelty, all the certainty she'd walked in with. "Find the rest of it. Whatever's in there. I need to know." A pause. "Please." That please was the second one of the night. And it cost her more than the first. Daniel nodded. Then he turned back to the wall of equations, and he got to work in earnest. What followed was the strangest hour any of them would ever spend. Because a room that had come for a party, and then stayed for a spectacle, slowly turned into something else. A classroom, a courtroom, an operating theater. Daniel worked through the model line by line, and Dr. Chen worked beside him, and the two of them fell into a rhythm that anyone who'd ever seen real mathematicians work would recognize, the terse, fast, almost wordless shorthand of two minds meeting on the same plane. Third quadrant, Daniel would say, writing. The interest rate term. He's using a normal distribution for the shocks. Fat tails. Chen would answer, not even a question. Right. Real rates don't move on a bell curve, they jump. He's got no jump component. So the model thinks a 5 sigma event happens once every 10,000 years. When in reality, every 7-8 years, give or take. Chen would study his work for 3 seconds, then nod once to the room. Confirmed. He's right. The distribution assumption understates tail risk by orders of magnitude. And the room would exhale, and someone would swear softly, and another few $100 million of confidence would drain out of sterling capital. Daniel found a fourth error, then a fifth. Some were honest. The ordinary mistakes any complex thing accumulates, forgivable, fixable. But some of them, like Gerald's coefficient, had that same fingerprint on them. That same quiet dishonesty. A number nudged. Here an assumption softened their always in the same direction, always making the fund look safer, calmer, more bulletproof than it was. It was like watching someone slowly discover that the beautiful old house they'd bought had termites in every beam. And through it all, Daniel talked. Not to show off, he'd stopped thinking about the cameras entirely. He talked because he couldn't help it, because teaching was as deep in him as the math itself, because some part of him that had been starving for 5 years was finally being fed. He'd write a line of stochastic calculus and then turn around and explain it to a room full of hedge fund managers like they were bright ninth graders, and the incredible thing was, they followed. He had that gift, the rarest one. He could take the thing at the top of the mountain and carry it down to where you were standing. "You see," he said at one point, mid-derivation marker squeaking, "people think math is about being smart. It's not. It's about being honest, brutally honest. The equation doesn't care how you feel or what you need to be true. It just tells you what is. And the whole trick, the only trick, is to keep listening to it even when it's telling you something you don't want to hear." He glanced just for a second at Gerald Voss sitting slumped and gray in his chair. The second you start arguing with the math, the second you reach in and change the answer because you don't like it, that's the second it stops being math and starts being a lie with numbers on it. Dr. Chen, checking his last line, murmured, "Confirmed." And then quieter, just to him, "Where did you study?" Daniel's marker paused on the paper. It was the question. The one Victoria had asked at the very start of all this, the one he hadn't answered. Only now it was coming from a different mouth in a different tone. Not a challenge, not a trap, but the genuine hungry curiosity of one mathematician recognizing another. "I read a lot of books," Daniel said. The small answer, the safe one. Dr. Chen looked at him for a long moment over the top of her glasses. She'd spent 40 years around brilliant young people. She knew the ones who'd been polished by every advantage, and she knew the other kind, the ones who'd taught themselves in the dark, who carried their brilliance like a secret, because the world had never given them a place to set it down. She knew which kind Daniel was the moment he picked up the marker, but she didn't push. She just nodded and let him keep his door closed and said loud enough for the room, "Whatever books they were, this city owes them a library." And she went back to checking his math. By the time he found the seventh error, the mood in the room had shifted so completely that it was hard to remember. It had ever been a party. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was filming for fun. They were filming because they understood they were witnessing something, though they couldn't have said exactly what. The investors weren't looking at Daniel like a curiosity anymore. They were looking at him like a lifeboat. And Victoria Sterling was looking at him like a question she couldn't stop asking herself. She'd pulled a chair to the front off to the side, and she sat in it with her elbows on her knees and watched him work with an intensity that was almost unbearable. She wasn't defending anymore. She wasn't performing. She was studying him, the way he moved, the way he thought, the way the whole architecture of a problem seemed to unfold in his head faster than his hand could write it down. And Daniel could feel it, that gaze, and he understood something about it that most of the room didn't. She wasn't just watching a man dismantle her company. She was watching a man do the thing she had built her entire life around being the best at and doing it better. She was watching her deepest belief about the world, the belief that had powered every ruthless decision she'd ever made, the belief that talent came from the right schools and the right doors and the right pedigree. She was watching that belief die in real time, killed by a waiter with a rolled-up sleeve and a library card. "That's 7, Daniel said, finally capping the marker. He was breathing a little hard. There was ink on his hands and on his shirt cuff, and a smudge of it on his jaw where he'd wiped sweat. 7 material errors. 3 of them are honest mistakes, bad assumptions, the kind any team makes, all fixable. 4 of them are not. He set the marker down on the table gently, like it was something that deserved respect. 4 of them are places where somebody looked at the truth and decided to hide it. And every single one of those 4 points in the same direction, making the fund look safer than it is. He turned to Dr. Chen. "Doctor, anything I got wrong?" Eleanor Chen looked at the wall of paper. All the torn sheets taped and stacked dense with the work of the last hour. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they'll remember for the rest of their life. Then she turned to the room and she spoke slowly, clearly, so there could be no mistake, so the cameras would carry it exactly as she meant it. "I have spent my entire career," she said, "around some of the finest mathematical minds in the world. I trained a generation of them at Columbia. I refereed the papers that built half the models on Wall Street." She paused. In 1 hour with no notes, no computer, and no warning, this man has correctly identified 7 flaws in a model that a 12-person team spent 19 months building. Every claim he made I checked. Every one of them is correct. Her voice didn't waver. I have never seen anything like it. Not from a graduate student. Not from a tenured professor. Not from anyone. She looked at Daniel, and her old eyes were bright. Young man, I don't know what a restaurant is doing employing you, but I promise you, it's the greatest misallocation of talent in this city, and this city wastes a lot of talent. The room was silent, and then somebody started to clap. It was Priya, the young analyst, the one who'd brought him the marker. She stood up and she clapped. At first her face wet, and then Ed Harrison stood up next to her and put his big hands together, and then it spread the way. The laughter had spread an hour ago, except it wasn't laughter now. It was the other thing. The opposite thing. Table by table, until 300 of the wealthiest people in New York City were on their feet, applauding a waiter, and the sound of it filled the room and rolled up against the ceiling and out through the cameras to the thousands of people already watching online. Daniel stood in the middle of it, and he did not smile. He did not raise his arms or take a bow or soak it in. Because in the middle of all that noise, all that thunder, all that sudden overwhelming seeing, after 5 years of being invisible, Daniel Brooks was thinking about only one thing. He was thinking that his daughter was asleep in Queens. I was thinking that she didn't know any of this was happening. That in the morning she'd wake up and do her hair the crooked way he did it and ask him to check her math, and he'd say, I read a lot of books. The small answer, the safe one, except maybe he wouldn't this time. Maybe after tonight he couldn't. Maybe after tonight the door he'd kept locked for 5 years was open, whether he was ready or not, because it was open on camera in front of the world, and there was no folding this up small and putting it away. The applause kept going, and through it, Victoria Sterling rose from her chair. She walked toward him slowly through the noise, and the room quieted as she moved because they didn't know what she was going to do, and neither did she, not fully. She stopped in front of him. Close. Close enough that the cameras strained to catch what passed between them. For a moment, she just looked at him. This man she'd told to sit down. This man she'd threatened to run out of the city. This man who'd taken her empire apart with a marker and never once raised his voice. You could have let me walk out of here tonight, she said quietly. You knew what was in that model. You could have said nothing, kept your job. Let me fly to London tomorrow and put another $1 billion into a machine that was going to blow up in everyone's face. Her voice caught just slightly. Why didn't you? And Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her past the money and the fear and the 4 billion things she was in that moment, and he gave her the only answer he had. Because somebody's grandmother has her whole life in that fund, he said, and she trusted you, and you didn't even know you were about to lose it for her. He shook his head slow. I've spent 5 years being invisible, ma'am. I know exactly what it feels like to be a person nobody sees. I wasn't going to do that to her. The room was dead silent now. And Victoria Sterling, $11 billion, the most feared woman on Wall Street, the woman who'd walked into this room believing she understood exactly how the world was sorted and who deserved to be, where Victoria Sterling looked at the waiter who'd just told her the truth. And she asked the question that would change everything that came after. Who are you? Who are you? Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at the marker still in his hand, at the ink on his fingers, and for a second the room could see him deciding something. Some door swinging on its hinge, not sure yet which way it would fall. I'm a waiter, he said finally. I told you that already. No. Victoria shook her head. No, you're not. A waiter doesn't do what you just did. Nobody I've ever met does what you just did, and I've spent my whole life around the smartest people money can buy. She stepped closer. So I'm going to ask you again, and this time I want the real answer. Where did you learn this? Who trained you? Because somebody did. This isn't self-taught. It is actually. Daniel's voice was quiet, but it cut clean through hers. Self-taught. Mostly. The last 5 years anyway. That's not possible. You keep saying that. A tired half smile. That's not possible. That's a hypothetical. That's not how any of this works. You've been saying it all night, ma'am, and every time you say it, it turns out you're wrong." He set the marker down. "Maybe the problem isn't the world. Maybe it's the size of the box you keep trying to fit it into." Somewhere in the room, someone let out a low breath. Ed Harrison was still on his feet. Dr. Chen hadn't moved from Daniel's side. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she didn't fire back the way she would have an hour ago. Something in her head changed. She was looking at him differently now, not the way you look at an employee, or an obstacle, or a curiosity. The way you look at someone you're afraid you've badly misjudged. "Then tell me," she said. "The last 5 years, before that, all of it. You clearly want to keep it locked up, and I don't understand why a man who can do that," she gestured at the wall of equations, "would spend 5 years carrying my champagne and letting people look through him like glass. So help me understand. Because right now, standing here, I feel like the biggest fool in this room. And I don't like the feeling, and I don't understand it, and I want to." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. And then Dr. Chen, gently from beside him, said the thing that broke it open. "Son," she said, "I recognized your work." Daniel turned to her. "The moment you wrote the third line," she went on. Her voice low, meant mostly for him, but the room too quiet not to hear it. "That notation you use for the volatility surface, that particular way of collapsing the tensor. I've only seen that once before. In a paper, years ago. A young researcher, a preprint that never got published, that everyone in the field passed around because it was so far ahead of its time, and then—" She stopped, studied his face. "And then the author vanished. Just disappeared off the earth. We assumed he'd gone to some hedge fund, gotten rich, stopped caring about the pure work." Her voice softened. "That was you, wasn't it?" The room was so silent, Daniel could hear his own pulse. Wasn't it Daniel? And Daniel Brooks, 34 years old, ink on his hands, standing in the wreckage of a party in front of 300 people, and a dozen cameras, felt the door he'd been holding shut for 5 years finally swing all the way open. And there was nothing on the other side of it but the truth. "Yeah," he said, barely a whisper. "That was me." Dr. Chen closed her eyes for a second, like a prayer or a grief. "What happened to you?" she said. And so he told them. Not all of it. Not at first. He started small because that's how you start a thing you've buried. "My name's Daniel Brooks," he said to the room, now to the cameras, because he understood there was no half measure left. 11 years old, I was a doctoral candidate. Applied mathematics, stochastic processes, the same class of models you're all looking at on that screen. He nodded at it. I was good. I'm not going to be modest about it because I'm too tired and it doesn't help anybody. I was very good. I had offers. Princeton wanted me. There was a professorship on the table, the kind of thing that takes most people 20 years to earn, and I was going to have it at 28. He paused. And then I met a woman named Sarah. His voice changed on the name. The whole room heard it. Sarah was a nurse, pediatric oncology. She spent her days with sick kids and their terrified parents, and she came home every night having given away more of herself than any human being can afford to give away. And then she got up the next morning and did it again. A small broken smile. She thought my math was ridiculous. She used to say, "Daniel, you have this gift, this once-in-a-generation gift, and you're going to spend it making rich people richer." She didn't get it. Which was the best thing about her. She kept me honest. She was the only person in my life who was never once impressed by how smart I was, and God, I needed that. You have no idea how much a person like me needs one person who isn't impressed. Somewhere in the room, a woman put her hand over her mouth. "We got married. We had Ava." His voice steadied on his daughter's name the way it always did, like a hand finding a railing. "And I turned down Princeton. I took a lecturer position instead. Less money, less prestige. But it was in the city near Sarah's hospital, near the life we were building. Everyone told me I was throwing my career away. My advisor stopped speaking to me for a year. And I didn't care, because I'd figured out the secret nobody tells you when you're young and gifted, and everybody's telling you how far you're going to go." He looked around the room. "The secret is that none of it means anything if you go there alone." He stopped. The next part was harder. You could see him gathering himself to say it. 5 years ago," he said. Sarah was driving home from a double shift. She'd stayed late because a kid in her ward was scared, and the kid's mom couldn't get there till midnight, so Sarah stayed so the little boy wouldn't be alone. His jaw worked. And on the way home, a man who'd had too much to drink ran a red light on Northern Boulevard. The silence in the room had weight now. Physical weight. "She was gone before the ambulance got there," Daniel said. 31 years old. And I had a 4-year-old daughter who kept asking me when Mommy was coming home. He drew a breath that shook just slightly at the edges. "So I'll tell you what happened to that promising young mathematician, Dr. Chen." That's what happened to him. He buried his wife on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday, his daughter woke up and needed breakfast, and there was nobody left to make it but him. And the professorship, and the papers, and the gift. Everybody kept talking about. None of it could make a 4-year-old her breakfast. None of it could do her hair. None of it could sit up with her at 3 in the morning when she woke up screaming for a mother who was never coming back. His voice cracked finally, and he let it. So I put it down. All of it. I walked into the department chair's office and I resigned, and the man looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But I had a little girl who needed a father more than the world needed another paper. So I chose her. Nobody in the room moved. "I needed a job that didn't come home with me," he went on. "That's the thing about the restaurant. When I leave, I leave. No grant deadlines, no papers to referee at midnight, nothing, following me back to Queens. I clock out, and I'm hers. Completely hers. Every hour that isn't paying the rent belongs to my daughter, and that was the deal I made, and I have never once regretted it." He paused. "But I couldn't kill the math. I tried. God knows I tried because it hurt too much to keep it alive. It felt like keeping a room in the house that Sarah used to live in, walking past that door every day. But you can't stop being what you are. So at night, after Ava's asleep, when the apartment's quiet, I go to the library, the big one on 5th. Or I sit at the kitchen table with a stack of books and I do the work. Not for anyone. Not for a career. Not for money. Not for a single soul who will ever read it. Just for me. Just to stay alive on the inside." He looked at Dr. Chen. "That paper you saw, doctor. The one that made the rounds, I wrote most of it after midnight at a kitchen table in Queens with a baby monitor next to my notebook." Dr. Chen was crying. She wasn't trying to hide it. "And that," Daniel said, turning back to Victoria, "is who I am. That's the whole answer to your question. I'm a widower who does math at night because it's the only way I know how to keep breathing, and who serves champagne during the day because my daughter likes to eat. Both of those are true at the same time. I stopped thinking they were a contradiction a long time ago." He met her eyes level, unafraid. "So when you look at me and you can't understand how a waiter knows this, the problem isn't me, ma'am. The problem is that you decided a long time ago that a person is only ever one thing. And people aren't. People are everything they've ever been all at once, all the time. You just have to be willing to see it." Victoria Sterling stood there, and for the first time all night, she had nothing to say, because she was thinking about her own life. Nobody in that room knew it. She'd spent 15 years making sure nobody knew it, but Victoria Sterling had not started at the top. She'd started in a trailer park outside Bakersfield, with a mother who cleaned houses, and a father who left, and she'd clawed her way up through scholarships and sleepless nights, and 100 rooms where people looked at her the way this whole room had first looked at Daniel. And somewhere along the way to survive it, she'd made a decision. She'd decided that the way to never be looked down on again was to become someone who looked down. To get so high so fast, so far above where she'd started, that nobody could ever put her back there. And she'd built an entire philosophy to justify it. Talent comes from the right schools, the right doors. The system is a meritocracy, and I earned my place, and the people below me are below me for a reason. She'd needed to believe that. Because the alternative that she'd made it through luck and grit, and 100 people who'd taken a chance on her, and that there were 1,000 others just as capable who never got that chance. That alternative meant her whole worldview was a lie. She told herself to sleep at night. And now a waiter was standing in front of her, taking that lie apart as cleanly as he'd taken apart her model. I came from nothing too, she heard herself say. The room turned to her. She hadn't planned to say it. It just came out. She stopped, started again, and her voice was different, smaller, younger. I don't talk about it, ever. My team would tell you I grew up comfortable, went to Wharton. That's the story we sell. It's not true. I grew up in a trailer in California. My mother cleaned houses for people who never learned her name. She looked at Daniel, and there was something raw in her face now, something that hadn't been there when she'd told him to sit down. I clawed my way up, and I told myself I did it alone because I was smart, because I was better, because I earned it. And I looked down on everyone who didn't make it out, because if I didn't, if I admitted they were just as smart as me and just never got the door to open. Her voice caught. Then I'd have to admit I got lucky. And people who get lucky can get unlucky. And I couldn't live with that. So I decided the world was fair. Because a fair world is a world where I deserve everything I have. Nobody breathed. And then she laughed, but it was wet and broken. Then you drop a tray of champagne and take my whole life apart in an hour. A man I would have walked past 1,000 times and never seen, and I realize. She pressed her hand to her mouth. For a second, gathered herself, dropped it. I realize I've spent 15 years building an empire on a lie I needed to be true. That the world is sorted correctly. That the people at the top belong there. She looked around the room at all the expensive faces watching her fall apart. And it's not true, fall apart. And it's not true. It was never true. There are Daniels everywhere. There are Daniels in every restaurant and every gas station and every trailer park in this country, and I built a machine that only ever bets on the ones who already had the door open. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. God, what a waste. What an obscene waste. For a long moment, the two of them just stood there, the billionaire and the waiter, the woman who'd escaped the bottom by pretending it didn't exist, and the man who lived in the middle of it by choice for love. And the whole room understood in a way that couldn't be put into words that something real was happening. That this wasn't a viral moment anymore. It was two people recognizing each other. It was Gerald Voss who ruined it. This is very moving, he said, standing up, and his voice had a nasty cornered edge to it. Really. Two hard luck stories, everyone's crying, wonderful television. But can we get back to reality? He turned to the room, to the youngsters, spreading his hands. Because here's the reality, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever this man is, genius, waiter, whatever, none of it changes the fact that Sterling Capital is managing your money right now tonight, and this whole performance has been broadcast live to God knows how many people, and by tomorrow morning every headline in the country is going to say the fund is a fraud. He pointed at Daniel. He didn't save your money, he torched it. The second this hit the internet, there's going to be a run on the fund. Everyone's going to pull out at once. And you know what happens when everyone pulls out of a fund at once? A cold smile. It collapses. The very thing he says he was trying to prevent. He didn't prevent it. He caused it. So maybe before we give the waiter a medal, we should ask whether he just cost every person in this room everything they had. And the terrible thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong. You could feel it move through the room, the fear curdling the wonder. Because Gerald had named the thing they were all privately terrified of. Ed Harrison's face went pale again. Murmurs started. Somebody near the back was already on their phone, and you could see the exact moment they pulled up the fund's numbers, the exact moment the panic started to take hold. He's right, someone said. Oh my God, he's right. If this goes viral, I need to call my people. How do we get out before? Daniel watched it happen. Watched an hour of truth threaten to turn into a stampede. And he understood with a sick certainty that Gerald had just handed the room away to make everything worse, that fear was about to do more damage than any hidden coefficient ever could. Stop, Daniel said. It wasn't loud, but something in it stopped them. Just stop, everybody, please, for 30 seconds. He held up his ink-stained hands. Listen to me. He's trying to scare you into doing the one thing that guarantees you lose. That's what a run is. It's fear turning a solvable problem into a fatal one. And I understand the fear, I do. But I need you to think for 30 seconds instead of panicking, because the math still works even when you're scared. That's the whole beauty of it." He took a breath. "The fund is not a fraud. Let me say that clearly for the cameras. The fund is real. The assets are real. The money in it is real, and most of it is invested in perfectly sound positions. The model is flawed. Those are two completely different things. A flawed model doesn't mean the money's gone. It means the risk was measured wrong. And a risk you measured wrong is a risk you can remeasure correctly, starting tonight." The room quieted, listening. "Here's what actually happens if you panic and pull out all at once," Daniel went on. "You force the fund to sell everything into a falling market at the worst possible prices. You crystallize losses that don't exist yet, and you turn a fixable model error into a real permanent hole in your own account. Gerald's not warning you about the danger. He's manufacturing it. Because a panic tomorrow morning buries the story of what he did tonight under a market crisis, and a man who buries his own crime under a bigger crisis is a man who's still thinking about himself." He looked at Gerald, and his voice went flat and hard. "You did it once already with the coefficient. You saw an ugly truth, and you tried to hide it because facing it was expensive. And you're doing the exact same thing right now in front of everyone, and you can't even see it. That's the tell, Gerald. That's how I know exactly what kind of man built that matrix." Gerald opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "So here's what I'd do if it were my money," Daniel said, turning back to the room. "And it's not, so take it for what it's worth. I would not pull out tomorrow. I would demand tonight in writing on these cameras 3 things. 1, an independent audit of the entire model, top to bottom, by someone with no stake in the outcome." He glanced at Dr. Chen. "I can think of at least one person in this room qualified to lead it. 2, the 4 dishonest terms get corrected immediately, and the fund holds the capital. It actually should have been holding all along, which is uncomfortable and less profitable and safe. And 3." He looked at Victoria, full disclosure. "To every investor, not spin, not a press release that buries it. The truth. We found flaws. Here they are. Here's how we fixed them. Here's who's accountable." He held her gaze. "You do that, and you don't have a fraud on your hands. You have the most honest fund on Wall Street, and in a business built entirely on trust. Honesty isn't the thing that kills you. It's the only thing that saves you." The room was silent, and then Ed Harrison slowly sat back down. "That," he said, "is the first thing anyone said all night that I actually believe." He looked at Daniel. "I'm not pulling out. If the audit's clean and the fixes are real, my 60 million stays." He glanced around at the others. "And if any of you panics and starts a run that tanks my position because you couldn't hold your nerve for one audit, I'll remember it. This is a small town up at our level. We all remember. That did it." The panic broke. You could feel the room exhale, the stampede backing down, step by step, fear giving ground to something steadier. And Victoria Sterling was staring at Daniel like she'd never seen a human being before in her life. "You just..." She shook her head slowly. "You just stopped a run on my fund. My fund. After I threatened to run you out of the city. After I told you to sit down." Her voice was thick. "You had every reason on earth to let it burn. To stand there and watch me lose everything the way I was going to let all these people lose everything. It would have been justice. And instead you..." She couldn't finish. "It wouldn't have been justice," Daniel said quietly. "It would have just been more people getting hurt. There's a difference. I learned it a long time ago." He looked at her, and there was no triumph in it, only a kind of exhausted kindness. "The man who ran that red light on Northern Boulevard, he wasn't a monster, ma'am. He was just a guy who made a terrible choice on a bad night. And you know what I figured out after wanting him to suffer? Never once brought Sarah back. Not for a single second. The only thing that ever helped, the only thing was pouring what I had left into the people still standing in front of me. My daughter. And tonight, apparently, a ghost of a smile, a room full of very wealthy strangers I'll never see again. Same principle. You take the gift you've got, and you spend it on whoever's in front of you who needs it. That's the whole thing. That's all I know." Victoria Sterling turned away from him. She turned to face Gerald Voss, and when she spoke, the softness was gone, replaced by something cold and final. Gerald, you're done. As of this moment, security's going to walk you out, and the compliance team's going to walk you straight into a very long conversation with the SEC. And I am going to spend whatever it costs to make sure you never touch another investor's dollar as long as you live. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. You reached into my company and you turned off the smoke detector, and a waiter had to be the one to notice. That's on you. But it's on me too, because I built a place where you thought you could get away with it, where the guy carrying the champagne was smarter than the guy running risk, and I never once thought to look. Then she turned back to Daniel, and the whole room held its breath, because everyone could feel that something was coming, that the night wasn't over, that it had one more turn left in it. I made you an offer earlier, she said, in front of all these cameras. I said if you found one material error, I'd write you a check for $5 million. She looked at the wall of equations at the 7 torn sheets taped to the screen. You found 7, 4 of them the kind that could have ended everyone in this room. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a checkbook, an actual checkbook, and somehow that small physical thing made 300 people lean forward. So I'm going to honor it, right now, on camera, the way I said I would. She uncapped a pen. And Daniel Brooks, a widower from Queens, who did math at a kitchen table with a baby monitor, who'd spent 5 years being invisible, who'd dropped a tray of champagne an hour ago and blown his whole quiet life apart. Daniel looked at the checkbook in the billionaire's hands, and he said, no. The room froze. No. Victoria looked up. Daniel, it's $5 million. Do you understand what that money does for you? For your daughter. That's a house. That's her college twice over. That's never worrying about rent again for the rest of your... I know exactly what it is, Daniel said, and his voice was steady and certain, and it carried to every corner of that silent room. I know exactly what $5 million is. I've spent 5 years counting every one of them. He shook his head slowly. But I didn't do this for a check. And if I take it, if I stand here and let you write me a number and cash it, then that's what tonight was. A waiter won a bet, a stunt, a viral moment. Everybody claps and goes home, and nothing actually changes. He looked around the room at all of them. And I don't want tonight to be a stunt. There's a school teacher in Ohio whose retirement was 30 seconds from being wiped out, and she'll never even know how close it came. There's a Priya. He nodded at the young analyst still standing. In every one of your companies who saw the same thing I saw and didn't have the standing to say it out loud. There's a version of me carrying a tray in every city in this country, and the only difference between them and this, he gestured at the equations, is that nobody ever asked them what was in their head. He set his jaw. So no, I don't want your check, Ms. Sterling. He held her gaze. I want something worth a whole lot more than $5 million, and I don't think you're going to want to give it to me. Victoria Sterling slowly lowered the pen. Then tell me, she said. What do you want? Then tell me, she said. What do you want? Daniel didn't answer for a moment. He looked down at his hands, the ink, the calluses from carrying trays, the wedding ring he'd never taken off. And when he looked back up, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room. I want you to build the door, he said. Victoria frowned. The door. The one that never opened for me. The one that never opened for Priya, or for 1,000 people just like us. He stepped toward her. You said it yourself 10 minutes ago. You built a machine that only ever bets on the people who already had the door open. Well, you've got $11 billion and a company and a room full of the most powerful people in America watching you right now on camera. So build a different door. A real one. Not a press release, not a charity gala where everybody pats themselves on the back and writes it off on their taxes. A real one. His voice was rising now, not in anger, but in something closer to fire. Find the people the system threw away. The ones behind the counter in the gas stations in the trailer parks. The ones who taught themselves in the dark because nobody ever handed them a desk. And give them a way in. Test them. Not on their pedigree, not on their zip code, not on where they went to school, on what's actually in their head. And when you find them, and you will, ma'am, they're everywhere you open the door and you let them through. The room was dead silent. That's what I want, Daniel said. That's my price, not $5 million in my pocket. I want you to take that money, take 10 times that money, you can afford it, and build the thing that would have changed my whole life if it had existed 11 years ago. He held her gaze unflinching. You want to make tonight mean something, that's how. Otherwise, I really am just a waiter who won a bet, and by next week nobody will remember my name, and nothing on God's earth will have changed. Victoria Sterling stared at him, and then slowly she started to laugh. Not cruelly, it was the laugh of someone who's been outmaneuvered so completely they can only admire it. You know what you just did, she said. You just turned down $5 million in front of 300 witnesses to ask me for something that's going to cost me 100 times that and make me look like a fool if it fails. She shook her head. You're either the smartest man I've ever met, or the craziest, and I honestly can't tell which. Sarah used to say the same thing, Daniel said. About me. She never could tell either. Something softened in Victoria's face at the sound of his wife's name. Here's the problem, though, she said. And now there was a challenge back in her voice, but a different kind. Not the cruel kind from the top of the night, the testing kind. You want me to build a program to find hidden genius, to go into the places nobody looks and pull out the people the system missed. That's a beautiful idea. It's also almost impossible to do well. You know how many companies have tried some version of it? How many diversity initiatives and pipeline programs turn into a photo op and a line item and change absolutely nothing? She stepped closer. You want it to be real. Fine. Then it needs someone real to run it. Someone who actually knows what it's like to be the person behind the counter. Someone who can look at a self-taught kid from nowhere and know in 5 minutes whether there's something there because he's been that kid. She let it hang. So I'll build your door, Daniel. On one condition. What condition? You run it. The room stirred. You come work for me, Victoria said. Not as a token. Not as a mascot for a press release. I want you as the head of a new division. Real budget, real authority, real title. You report to me directly, and nobody in this company outranks you on this. You design the program. You pick the people. You find the Daniels and the Priyas, and you drag them through the door yourself, because you're the only person I've ever met who could actually do it right. She paused. That's my counteroffer. You want me to change how this company finds talent? Then get inside the company and change it. From a lecture hall, from a kitchen table in Queens, you can't. From the 17th floor of Sterling Capital, you can. Daniel didn't answer. Because for the first time all night, the man who'd had an answer for everything, who'd taken apart an $11 billion model without breaking a sweat, didn't know what to say. He stopped. His eyes went somewhere far away, and the whole room could see it. The calculation happening behind them, but not a mathematical one this time. A human one. I have a daughter, he said finally. I know. You've mentioned her about 6 times tonight. No, you don't understand. His voice tightened. The only reason I do what I do, the restaurant, the leaving it at the door, is her. When I clock out, I'm hers. Completely. That was the deal I made when Sarah died. Ava comes first. Not sometimes. Not when it's convenient. First. He shook his head. And I know how these jobs go. I know them. I was on that track 11 years ago. Head of a division at a firm like this. That's 80-hour weeks. That's my phone going off at midnight. That's flying to London on a Tuesday and missing her school play on Wednesday. That's becoming exactly the kind of father I swore I'd never be. And I would rather carry a tray for the rest of my life. His voice cracked. Than become a man my daughter has to make an appointment to see. The room was quiet, and it was Dr. Chen again who spoke. Then make that the deal, she said gently. Daniel turned to her. You're negotiating with a woman who wants something from you, Chen said, and you're acting like you have no leverage. Son, you have all the leverage. Look around this room. She gestured at the 300 faces, the cameras, the wall of equations. She needs you more than you need her. So don't take her deal. Take a better one. Tell her what you need to be the father you promised to be, and let her figure out how to make it work. That's what people with leverage do. They set the terms. A small smile. You spent an hour tonight refusing to let a bad model go unchallenged. Don't you dare let a bad offer go unchallenged now. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to Victoria. All right, he said. Here's the deal. Not yours, mine. He squared his shoulders. I'll build your program. I'll run it. I'll find you people who'll make your MIT team look like they were standing still, and I'll build the door I never got. But he held up a finger. I'm home for dinner. Every night. 6 o'clock I'm in Queens at my kitchen table with my daughter. That's not negotiable, and it never will be. No midnight calls unless the building's literally on fire. No flying to London on a day I've got a school play. And if this job ever starts turning me into a man who's too busy to check his daughter's math homework, I walk that same day and I go back to carrying trays and I don't look back. He held her gaze. You want the best I've got. That's how you get the best I've got. A man who's whole, not a man who traded his kid for a title. Because I already know how that story ends, ma'am, and I buried the only person who could have stopped me from making that mistake twice. The room held its breath. And Victoria Sterling, who had built an empire on 80-hour weeks on midnight calls on flying to London on a Tuesday, on the absolute certainty that the top of the mountain was worth whatever you had to leave at the bottom to get there, looked at this man who was telling her to her face in front of everyone that all of it was worth less than dinner with a 9-year-old. And something in her face broke open. You know, she said quietly, I don't have kids. Never had time. That was always the trade I told myself I was making. That I'd have the career, the empire, the name, and someday later when it was all built, then I'd have the life. She laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. I'm 31, and I own $11 billion, and I can't remember the last time I ate dinner at a table instead of over a keyboard. And you're standing there in a waiter's uniform, turning down the exact life I gave up everything to get, and you're doing it because it's not worth as much as the life you already have. Her voice went thin. God, which one of us actually made it, Daniel? Nobody answered. Nobody could. Deal, Victoria said. Your terms, all of them. Home by 6, no midnight calls, no missed school plays. In writing, tonight. She extended her hand. And if I ever catch myself turning you into me, you have my permission to quit on the spot and tell me exactly why. Daniel looked at her hand, and then he took it and shook it, and the room erupted. The applause coming down like rain, like thunder. Thunder, 300 people on their feet for the second time that night. And this time, Daniel let a little of it in. Just a little. A small, tired, disbelieving smile, because somewhere under all the noise, a door that had been shut for 5 years had finally opened, and this time he'd walked through it on his own terms. But the night wasn't done with him yet, because as the applause was still ringing, a phone rang. Loud. Insistent. And it was Daniel's, the cheap prepaid he kept in his apron pocket, except his apron was folded on the table where he'd left it an hour ago, and the phone was buzzing against the wood, and the screen said, Ruth. Grandma Ruth, who was watching Ava, who never ever called during a shift. The blood drained out of Daniel's face. Everyone saw it. He crossed the room in 4 strides and snatched up the phone. Ruth, what's wrong is Ava. And the room, which had been so loud a second ago, went silent to listen, because they could all see the fear on him. The raw animal terror of a parent who's already lost one person and knows exactly how fast the phone can take another. Slow down, Daniel said. Ruth, slow down, I can't. He listened, and then his whole body changed. She's watching it right now. How is she? Ruth's voice tinny and audible in the silent room. Daniel, it's everywhere. Somebody put it online and it's everywhere. And Ava woke up and saw it on my phone. And she won't stop crying. She won't stop. She keeps saying, Daniel, you need to talk to her. Put her on. Ruth, put her on right now. Shuffling. And then a small voice, thick with tears, and it came through the phone into a room of 300 of the most powerful people in America, and not one of them made a sound. Daddy. Hey baby, I'm here. I'm right here. Daddy, are you everybody's watching you? There's a video, and you're doing the math, the real math, the kind you do at night when you think I'm asleep. Ava's voice hitched. Daddy, I've seen you. I've seen you at the kitchen table. I get up for water, and you're always there with your books. And you never told me. Why didn't you tell me you were like that? Why didn't you tell me you were the smartest one? And Daniel Brooks, who hadn't cried in front of another human being in 5 years, who'd held it together through the whole impossible night, put his hand over his eyes and broke. Because I didn't want you to think I gave it up because of you, he said, his voice cracking wide open. Baby, listen to me. Listen. I never gave it up. I chose you. Those aren't the same thing, you understand. Not for one single day did I ever feel like I lost something. I chose. Every night at that table, I wasn't grieving what I couldn't have. I was keeping a little piece of myself alive so that the daddy who tucked you in was a whole daddy. You didn't take anything from me, Ava. You're the reason there was anything left to keep. The line was quiet, except for a 9-year-old crying. Are you coming home? She said finally. I'm coming home. Are things going to be different now because of the video? Daniel looked up. At the room. At Victoria. At Dr. Chen. At the wall of equations. At the cameras still rolling. At the whole impossible night. And then back down at the phone. Yeah, baby, he said softly. I think some things are going to be different. A breath. But you know what's not going to be different? 6 o'clock. Dinner. Me and you at the table. That's never changing, I promise you. No matter what that video does, no matter what anybody offers me, 6 o'clock is ours. Forever. You hear me? I hear you. Good. Now go back to sleep. I'll be home before you wake up, and I'll do your hair the crooked way you like, and we'll figure out the rest together. Okay. Okay, Daddy. A pause. Daddy. Yeah. I'm really proud of you. And that undid him completely. He turned away from the room phone pressed to his ear, shoulders shaking, and for a moment, nobody in that ballroom was a billionaire, or a CEO, or a titan of anything. They were just people watching a father cry because his daughter told him she was proud of him, and half of them were crying too, and they didn't fully understand why. When Daniel finally lowered the phone and turned back around, wiping his eyes with the back of his ink-stained hand, Victoria Sterling was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face, the one from the trailer park, the one from before the money, the one that belonged to a little girl whose mother cleaned houses for people who never learned her name. That, she said quietly, is the thing I gave up, right there, that phone call. That's what I traded, she swallowed hard. I've closed billion-dollar deals. I've been on the cover of every magazine that matters. And I would trade every single one of them for one person on earth to call me at midnight and tell me they're proud of me. She wiped at her own eyes, quick embarrassed the way people do when they haven't cried in a long time. You keep your 6 o'clock, Daniel. God, you keep it with both hands. And if I ever try to take it from you, you won't, Daniel said. Because it's in writing, remember? She laughed, wet and real. It's in writing. And then, because the universe has a sense of timing, another voice cut across the room, sharp, official, unfamiliar. 2 people had come through the doors at the back, a man and a woman in dark suits, moving with the particular purpose of people who carry badges. The whole room turned. Victoria Sterling, the woman said, holding up an ID. SEC Enforcement Division. We've had a team monitoring the live stream for the last 40 minutes. She glanced at the wall of equations, at Gerald Voss, frozen white-faced in his chair, at Daniel standing there with tears still drying on his face. We're going to need to talk to a few people tonight, starting with him. She pointed at Gerald. Gerald Voss stood up so fast his chair fell over. You can't. I want a lawyer. You'll get one, the agent said calmly. Mr. Voss, you set a risk coefficient by hand to conceal your fund's true exposure from investors. We heard you admit it, on camera, to 300 witnesses. A thin smile. Frankly, you've made our week. As they led Gerald toward the doors, the man who'd built a lie into the heart of an $11 billion machine, now shrinking with every step. All his contempt for the help collapsed into something small and terrified. He stopped just for a second beside Daniel. You did this, he hissed. Daniel looked at him. And there was no anger in his face. If anything, there was something almost like pity. "No," Daniel said quietly. "You did this. I just read the numbers out loud." He held the man's eyes. "You want to know the difference between you and me, Gerald? We both saw an ugly truth tonight. You spent your whole career hiding from them. I spent mine learning to say them out loud, even when it cost me everything. That's the only difference. That's the whole difference." He nodded toward the agents. "Go on. And Gerald, maybe when this is all over, find somebody to be honest with. It's the only thing that ever actually helped me." They let him out. And the second agent, the man, walked over to Daniel and, to everyone's surprise, extended his hand. "For what it's worth," he said low, just for Daniel. "I've been chasing model fraud for 11 years. Cases like this take my office 18 months to build, if we can build them at all. You cracked it open in an hour with a marker." He shook his head. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Daniel looked at him. And this time the answer came easy. "Kitchen table in Queens," he said, "after my daughter went to sleep." The agent studied him for a second, then nodded slowly, like a man filing something away he wouldn't forget. "Well," he said, "whatever's next for you, the country could use more people who read the numbers out loud." And he handed Daniel a card. "If Sterling Capital ever stops being worth your time, my office is always looking for people who can see what everybody else missed. No pedigree required." Daniel took the card, turned it over in his ink-stained fingers. And something in his chest went tight, because it was the second door opening in one night, the second time in 5 years that the world had looked at him and seen not a uniform, but a mind. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it more than the man could know. The agents left. And slowly, the room began to empty, the investors filing out in 2s and 3s, but not the way people usually leave a party. Many of them stopped on the way to shake Daniel's hand, to say something quiet. Ed Harrison gripped his shoulder and said, "My grandkids' college fund is still whole because of you, son. I won't forget it. You ever need anything you call me." A woman pressed a card into his hand and said her foundation funded scholarships and she wanted to talk. Another man just looked at him, unable to find words, and finally said, "My father was a janitor. He was the smartest man I ever knew. Nobody ever," and couldn't finish and just squeezed Daniel's arm and walked away with his eyes wet. And Daniel understood, standing there receiving all of it, that he'd done something that night that went far beyond an equation. He'd cracked open something in every person in that room. The memory of some overlooked genius in their own lives. A parent, a sibling, a version of themselves they'd buried to survive. He'd made 300 of the most powerful people in America remember all at once that talent was everywhere and that they'd built their whole world on pretending it wasn't. Finally, the room was nearly empty. Just Daniel and Victoria, and Dr. Chen and Priya lingering near the back, and Marcus, who'd stood frozen against the wall for the entire 2 hours, who now walked slowly toward Daniel with an expression Daniel had never seen on his manager's face. "Daniel," Marcus said. He stopped. "I've worked next to you for 5 years. 5 years. And I never," his voice caught. "I told you to sit down too. In the kitchen when you first said something. I told you to keep your head down. I've been telling you to keep your head down for 5 years." He looked stricken. "I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry. I looked right at you every single day, and I never once." "Marcus." Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. "You gave me a job when I needed one that didn't come home with me. You gave me 5 years of leaving it at the door so I could be there for my kid. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing." He smiled. "You didn't keep me invisible. You kept me afloat. There's a difference, and I'll never forget it." Marcus nodded, unable to speak, and wiped his face and laughed at himself for wiping his face, and the two men who'd worked side by side for 5 years without ever really knowing each other stood there for a moment in something like friendship. And then Victoria's voice quiet from across the room. "Daniel, it's almost 11. Don't you have somewhere to be by 6? Daniel looked at her and smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I do." He picked up his folded apron from the table where he'd left it 2 hours and one entire lifetime ago. He looked at it for a moment, the cheap black fabric, the ink stain now bleeding across it, the uniform that had made him invisible for 5 years. And then, instead of leaving it behind, the way the story wanted him to, he folded it once more carefully and tucked it under his arm. Victoria noticed. "You're keeping it." "Yeah," Daniel said. "I'm keeping it." He looked at her. "Because someday when this fancy new office starts making me feel important, when I start thinking I'm better than the person carrying the tray, I'm going to take this out and put it on. And remember." He tucked it tighter under his arm. "The uniform never made me less than what I am. And the title's not going to make me more. I was always the same man. It just took a dropped tray of champagne for anybody to see it." He nodded to her, to Dr. Chen, to Priya, to Marcus. "Including me." And Daniel Brooks walked out of the Meridian for the last time, as a waiter apron under his arm, an SEC agent's card in one pocket, and a foundation director's card in the other. A handshake deal with a billionaire that would change his life, and a 9-year-old daughter in Queens, waiting to hear how far the story had gone. But it was the smallest thing that stayed with him the whole cab ride home through the empty midnight streets. Not the $5 million he'd turned down. Not the division he'd just been handed. Not the cameras, or the applause, or the badges. Just a small voice, thick with tears, saying 4 words he would carry for the rest of his life. "I'm proud of you." The cab pulled up outside the apartment building in Queens, a little before 1 in the morning, and Daniel sat in the back seat for a moment, before he got out, just looking up at the 3rd-floor window, where a light was still on. She'd waited up. Of course she'd waited up. He paid the driver, tucked the apron tighter under his arm, and climbed the stairs. He'd climbed 10,000 times. Except this time, his legs felt strange under him, like the whole world had shifted a few degrees while he wasn't looking, and he hadn't found his footing yet. He unlocked the door quietly, expecting to find Ava asleep on the couch with Grandma Ruth beside her. Instead, she was sitting at the kitchen table. His table. His books still stacked where he'd left them the night before, and Ava sitting there in her pajamas with her hair still in the crooked puffs from yesterday, and in front of her open was his notebook. The one he wrote in at night. The one he'd never shown her. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes were red from crying, but she wasn't crying now. She was studying him with an expression that was far too old for a 9-year-old, the same expression her mother used to get. "I looked at your book," she said, "while you were gone. I hope that's okay." Daniel set the apron down on the counter. "It's okay, baby." "I didn't understand most of it." She looked back down at the pages of symbols. "But I understood the first page, the one from a long time ago. The date was from before Mommy died." Daniel went very still. "It says..." Ava turned the notebook around so he could see it, and pointed to a line at the top of the first page in handwriting younger than his own, now ink faded with 5 years. "It says for Ava, so that someday she'll know her father was more than she got to see." She looked up at him. "You wrote that for me, before I could even read." And Daniel Brooks, who thought he'd done all his crying at the restaurant, crossed the kitchen and knelt down beside his daughter's chair and pulled her into him, and the two of them held each other at the kitchen table, at 1 in the morning, the same table where he'd kept himself alive for 5 years, and neither of them said anything for a long, long time. "I wanted you to have it," he said finally into her hair. "In case I never got to tell you. In case something happened to me too. I wanted there to be a record, that your daddy wasn't just a man who carried trays, that there was more, that you came from more." "But you are going to tell me," Ava said, pulling back to look at him. "Right. You're going to teach me the real math, the kind you do at night. If you want to learn it. I want to learn all of it." She said it fiercely, the way she said everything. "I want to be able to do what you did in the video. I want to be able to look at something everybody says is right and know it's wrong." Daniel smiled and wiped his eyes and pushed a stray puff of hair off her forehead. "That's not really about the math, baby," he said. "That's about something else. The math is just the language. The real thing is being willing to say the true thing out loud, even when everybody in the room wants you to be quiet, even when it costs you." He looked at her. "And you already have that. You've had it since you were 4 years old, asking me why you can't divide by 0. You get it from your mother. She had it more than anybody I ever met." Ava was quiet for a moment. Then, "Grandma Ruth said things are going to change. Because of the video. Because of the lady. Is that true? Some things are going to change, Daniel admitted. I got offered a new job tonight, a big one. It means I won't be a waiter anymore. What kind of job? I thought about how to explain it to a 9-year-old. And then he realized there was only one way, and it was the true way. You know how nobody at the restaurant ever knew what I could do, he said. How I could have helped a lot of people, but nobody ever asked because they only saw the uniform. Ava nodded. My new job is to go find people like that, all over the country. People who are smart, really smart, the kind of smart that could change things, but nobody ever gave them a chance. Because they're poor, or because of where they're from, or because of what they look like, or just because nobody ever bothered to ask what was in their head. He held her gaze. My job is to ask. And when I find them, my job is to open the door. The one that never opened for me. Ava considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. That's a good job, she decided. I think so too. Is it going to take you away? Like... And here her voice got smaller, more careful. The voice of a child who has already lost one parent and knows exactly what the world can take. Are you going to be like those dads who are never home? The ones on TV who are always at work? And Daniel took his daughter's face in both his hands, and he looked her dead in the eye, and he said the thing he'd made a billionaire put in writing 4 hours earlier. 6 o'clock, he said. Every night, dinner, me and you at this table. That's never changing, Ava. Not for any job, not for any amount of money, not ever. I made them promise. It's in writing. Signed by a woman worth $11 billion, and if she ever breaks it, I quit that same day and I come home. He pressed his forehead to hers. You will never ever have to make an appointment to see your father. Do you understand me? Never. That's the one thing in this whole world I will never let anybody take from us. Ava wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight, and Daniel held her, and Grandma Ruth, watching from the doorway where she'd been standing the whole time, wiped her eyes with the corner of her sweater, and quietly went to put the kettle on. Daniel did Ava's hair, the crooked way she liked, before she finally fell asleep a little after 2. And then he sat at his kitchen table in the quiet, with his notebook open and his cold cup of tea, and he did not do any math. He just sat there, thinking about Sarah, thinking about the strange, impossible arc of a single night, thinking about a tray of champagne he'd dropped on a marble floor, and how the smallest thing a decision made in half a second, his hands moving before his mind gave permission, had cracked his whole life open and let the light back in. You'd have liked how it ended, Sarah, he thought. You always said the gift was wasted, making rich people richer. Tonight I used it to stop them from hurting people. I think that's the version you'd have wanted. I think that's the version that was worth keeping alive all this time. He closed the notebook. And for the first time in 5 years, he went to bed feeling like a whole man. The video, of course, did what videos do. By the time Daniel woke up the next morning, it had been watched 40 million times. By the end of the week, it was past 200 million. It had a name now. People were calling it The Waiter and the Billionaire. And it was on every morning show and every news site and every feed in the country. The clip of him turning down $5 million had its own life. The clip of him on the phone with his daughter had another. And the moment he held up his apron and said, "The title's not going to make me more. I was always the same man," that one got stitched onto 100,000 videos printed on posters, read aloud in graduation speeches by people who'd never met him. Daniel hated most of it. He was a private man who just had his most private grief broadcast to the world. But he made his peace with it when the letters started coming. Because the letters were the whole point. They came by the thousands. From a line cook in Detroit who'd taught himself to code on a library computer and never told anyone. From a home health aide in Alabama who'd been solving her employer's accounting problems in her head for years and never dared say it out loud. From a 19-year-old kid in a town in West Virginia with no college for 100 miles who'd written in careful handwriting. I do math in my head all day at the gas station, and I always thought there was something wrong with me. Your video was the first time I thought maybe there's nothing wrong with me. Maybe I just never had a door. Daniel read every single one. He answered as many as he could. And every letter went into a box, and the box went on a shelf in what was about to become his office. And he told Victoria on his first day, These are the job. Everything else is just details. The program launched 3 months later. They called it the Sarah Brooks Initiative. Victoria had suggested naming it after Daniel. Daniel had said no and named it after his wife instead, because Sarah was the one who'd spent her whole life seeing the people. Other people looked past the scared kids, the exhausted parents, the ones the system was too busy to notice. It was hers, really, all of it. He was just carrying it forward. The way it worked was simple, which was the whole radical point of it. There was no application that asked where you went to school. There was no resume screen. There was a test, a real one, a hard one, designed by Daniel and Dr. Eleanor Chen, who came out of retirement to build it with him. And the test didn't care who you were or where you came from. It only cared what was in your head. Anyone could take it. A waiter, a gas station attendant, a home health aide, a 19-year-old in West Virginia. You took the test, and if you had it, the real thing, the door opened. A scholarship, a job, a mentor, a way in. In the first year, they placed 40 people. 40 people the system had thrown away, now working at the highest levels of finance and technology and research. By the third year, it was 400. By the fifth, the model had been copied by a dozen other companies, some of whom had laughed at Victoria when she announced it, and one of whom had been in that ballroom the night Daniel dropped the tray. The 19-year-old from West Virginia, his name was Cody, took the test and scored in the top 1% Daniel had ever seen. Daniel flew out to meet him himself. Not fly to London on a Tuesday, fly to a small town in West Virginia on a Saturday, and be home for 6 o'clock dinner on Sunday. He sat across from Cody in a diner and watched the kid's hands shake around a coffee cup and said, "You're not broken, son. You never were. You're just a door that nobody ever opened, and I came a long way to open it. So let's talk about what you want to do with your life." And Cody put his head down on the diner table and cried, and Daniel sat with him and didn't say anything, because sometimes there's nothing to say, and the sitting is the whole thing. Cody Barnett published his first paper at 22. It cited Daniel's old preprint, the one Dr. Chen had recognized, the one written at a kitchen table with a baby monitor. The circle closed quietly, the way the most important things always do. Victoria Sterling changed too. Not all at once, people don't, but really and permanently. She fixed the fund exactly the way Daniel had laid out that night. The 4 dishonest terms corrected the real capital, held full disclosure to every investor. And the strangest thing happened, the thing Gerald Voss had never understood in his whole cynical life. The investors didn't run. They stayed. Because in a business built entirely on trust, the fund that stood up on camera and said, "We found our own flaws, and here's exactly how we fixed them," became the most trusted fund on Wall Street. Sterling Capital doubled in 2 years. Honesty, it turned out, was the best trade she'd ever made. But that wasn't the real change in her. The real change was smaller, and it was this: about a year after that night, Victoria Sterling adopted a daughter. A little girl 7 years old out of the foster system. A kid the system had thrown away, same as Daniel, same as Cody, same as the waiter she'd once told to sit down. And she called Daniel of all people the night before she brought the girl home, terrified, and said, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be somebody's whole world. I only ever learned how to build things." And Daniel said, 6 o'clock, start there, dinner. Every night at the table, just the two of you. Everything else you'll figure out. But you protect the 6 o'clock with your life, and the rest will come. And it did. Gerald Voss went to prison for 2 years and paid a fine that took most of what he had. When he got out, no one on Wall Street would touch him. He'd become a cautionary tale, the man who reached in and turned off the smoke detector undone by a waiter with a marker. He wrote Daniel a letter once from prison. It was 3 pages long and full of excuses for the first 2.5, and then at the very end it said, "You told me to find somebody to be honest with." I didn't understand it then. I think I might now. I've been honest with exactly one person in here, a chaplain, and it's the only time in 10 years I've slept through the night. So, for whatever it's worth, thank you for the worst and most important night of my life. Daniel read it and sat with it, and then he wrote back 4 words. It's never too late, because he believed that. He'd staked his whole life on it. Marcus, the floor manager, got promoted to general manager of the Meridian 8 months later, and he told the story of that night to every new server he ever trained. Not as a story about a genius, as a story about a warning. Every person who walks through that door, he'd say, every single one in a uniform or a $5,000 suit, you don't know what's in their head. You don't know what they gave up, or what they survived, or what they could do if somebody just asked. I worked next to the smartest man in New York for 5 years, and I told him to keep his head down. Don't be me. Look at people. Really look at them. And a lot of young servers rolled their eyes at the old story. But a few of them didn't. And that was enough. And Daniel Brooks, became over the years exactly the thing Dr. Chen had said he was. That night, one of the most respected mathematical minds in the country. His work at Sterling Capital, and then later in his own research, helped rebuild how the whole industry measured risk. He testified before Congress twice. He turned down a dozen offers that would have made him unimaginably wealthy and taken him away from Queens, and took the ones that let him stay. He never once broke 6 o'clock. Not for anyone. Not for any amount of money. The billionaire who'd hired him kept her word, and when she occasionally forgot it and called at midnight, he didn't answer, and she learned and she respected him more for it than she respected almost anyone alive. He kept the apron. It hung framed on the wall of his office, the cheap black fabric, the ink stain still bleeding across it. Visitors always asked about it. Titans of industry. Brilliant young recruits, journalists doing profiles. Why do you have a waiter's apron framed on your wall? And Daniel would tell them the same thing every time, the thing he'd said to Victoria in the empty ballroom. Because the uniform never made me less than what I am. And the title never made me more. I was always the same man. It just took a dropped tray for anybody to see it, including me. And then he'd add the part he'd figured out later, the part that mattered most. The apron's here to remind me that somewhere out there right now, there's another one. Another mind nobody's looking at. Behind a counter. In a gas station. In a trailer park. And my whole job, the only job that ever mattered, is to go find them before the world convinces them they're nothing. Ava grew up. She learned the real math, all of it, at the kitchen table, where her father had kept himself alive. She was good, not just good, extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that made her father's eyes sting when he watched her work through a problem, because she had his mind and her mother's fire. And God help the world when those two things came together in one person. She went to college. She got in on her own merit. Though she could have walked through any door in the country on her father's name and refused to. And on the first day, when a professor looked at her name on the roster and said, "Brooks, any relation to the Daniel Brooks?" She smiled and said, "He's my dad. But don't grade me on that. Grade me on what's in my head." And the professor laughed and understood and never forgot it. At her graduation, Daniel sat in the audience, not on the phone, not flying to London, not too busy, but there in the third row, exactly where he'd promised her mother 18 years ago he would always be. And he watched his daughter walk across the stage, and he thought about a tray of champagne on a marble floor and a decision made in half a second. And the strange truth that the worst night of his life and the best night of his life had been separated by exactly 5 years and one dropped tray. Sarah wasn't there to see it. She never would be. That was the wound that never fully closed, and Daniel had stopped expecting it to. But he'd learned over 18 years to carry it differently. Not as a thing that emptied him, but as a thing that had filled him, that had pointed him on one impossible night toward the words he was born to say out loud. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe there's an error." 6 words. His whole life had turned on 6 words, and he never regretted a single one. After the ceremony, Ava found him in the crowd, still in her cap and gown, and she hugged him the way she'd hugged him at the kitchen table when she was 9 years old, fierce and complete. "Dad," she said, "I have to tell you something." "What is it, baby?" "You know the thing you always say, about there being another one out there, another mind nobody's looking at." She pulled back to look at him. "I want to do what you do, not the math. I mean the math too, but that. Finding them. Opening the door." Her eyes were bright and certain, and they were her mother's eyes exactly. I want to spend my life finding the people nobody's looking at, the way somebody found you. And Daniel Brooks looked at his daughter, the 4-year-old, who'd asked him when mommy was coming home, the 9-year-old who'd found his notebook at the kitchen table, the woman standing in front of him now in a cap and gown, ready to carry the whole thing forward. And he understood that this was the answer to a question he'd been asking since the night Sarah died. Whether he'd chosen right. Whether walking away from the lecture hall to raise a little girl alone had been worth the gift he'd buried. It had been worth it. It had all been worth it. Because the gift was never really in the equations. The gift was in seeing. Seeing the people. The world looked past, the way Sarah saw them. The way he'd learned to see them. The way his daughter now wanted to spend her life seeing them. He hadn't buried the gift when he became a waiter. He'd just been carrying it quietly for 18 years until it was ready to be handed to the one person who could carry it further than he ever could. "Yeah," he said, and his voice broke, and he didn't care who saw. "Yeah, baby, go find them, every last one, and when the world tells you they're nothing." He pulled her in and held her tight. This daughter he'd chosen over everything. This life that had turned out to be worth more than every door he'd ever refused to walk through. "You tell them what I know to be true. What I'd stake my whole life on. What a dropped tray of champagne taught a room full of billionaires on the night everything changed." He looked at her, and he said the words like the fact they were. "Talent doesn't ask for permission. It only waits for someone brave enough to see it."